Well, welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the U.S. presidential race and how the outcome could impact Washington's relationship with Moscow and beyond. Let's get back to our panel right now. Ray, you know, we see a lot of negative perceptions being generated here in the United States about Russia, about President Putin, a lot of it by the media. Let's listen to what Stephen Cohen, the professor emeritus at New York University as well as Princeton University, a Russian scholar, he said during an interview on CNN.
We're in a more war with Russia. We're approaching nation with Russia, both along Russia's borders and possibly over Syria. There is absolutely no debate about this in the American media, including, forgive me, on CNN. Then along comes unexpectedly Donald Trump, who says something that suggests he wants to end the new Cold War, cooperate with Russia in various places, what we used to call détente, and only can be called neo-McCarthyite charges that he's a Russian agent, that he's a Manchurian candidate, that he's Putin's client. So the real danger is what's being done to our own political process.
So, Ray, firstly, let me ask you this. Are we heading into a new Cold War here?
Well, we're well into a one-sided Cold War. The problem is that Putin won't cooperate.
He doesn't want to fight the war?
We mounted a coup on his doorstep. And what he did was just to make sure there's only all-weather, all-year naval port was secured by holding the referendum in Crimea. So-called pro-Russian separatists are active in the eastern Ukraine, but that's just because the Minsk Accords, ones that are supposed to give them some regional autonomy, have not been honored by the regime in Kiev. The regime in Kiev is rife with protests. Now, if you look at Putin, and you look at his experience, he was born after the war, but his big brother was killed and died in Leningrad in the siege. You know, when he looks at all this and sees 31,000 NATO troops on the border between Poland and Russia, well, the last time that happened was 75 years ago when they went into Russia, right? Mm-hmm. So I have been impressed by his sang-froid, his unwillingness to be provoked, and I think he has the high cards because this is his neighborhood. Not only that, but I would mention one other thing. I would have expected the Chinese, as sensitive as they are to people who invade or change borders, I would have expected them to criticize what Mr. Putin did in Crimea. No way did they. So there's an alliance, in effect, between China and Russia, and you have players like Iran and India and others, really important countries, that are really prepared to thumb their nose at the United States unless it seems to behave a little better. And it's not behaving any better when the German foreign minister accuses it of what's the word? He's stoking up artificial tension on the border between Poland and Russia. This has got to stop, or else the U.S. will continue to erode what respect it has in the rest of the world.
Vladimir, when we look at these big developments in the region, if we look at what Ray has been talking about, what's happening in Ukraine right now, the fact that the Minsk agreement is not being honored in the eastern part of Ukraine, the fact that NATO has expanded eastwards, the fact that NATO is also talking about anti-missile technology and deployments along Russia's border, what does one make of it? Is Paul...
My feeling is that Ukraine was absolute fiasco. This idea of NATO expansion, idea of kind of provoking Russia or trying to prove something to Russia by wrestling Ukraine from under its influence, totally failed. But this current administration and people who put it in, it works, are not willing to acknowledge it. And they're pushing further and further, and rather than solving it somehow, kind of settling it, they actually escalating it. And this is really ridiculous. So in that sense, for any person with a common sense who is kind of, aware that Cold War can become hot war, we really need to reset a button. So the way to reset a button, I suspect, and that's one of the reasons what I personally would prefer, and I would vote for Donald Trump, because we need some kind of new leadership who won't be afraid to say, let's rethink about it. Because people who are put this failed policy like Victoria Nuland are scheduled to be in charge, under Hillary Clinton, and I think they're not going to back off. So that's as simple as that.
Jim, as far as pushing a reset button, that was a question that was posed by our correspondent at the end of her report from Moscow. Is that likely to happen? Are we going to see the election rhetoric cool down? We're going to have the election, and then we're going to see, pragmatic policies being adopted?
I think it depends on who wins, frankly.
Right.
When it comes to, I'm actually much more pessimistic than my two colleagues. I think we are in a Cold War. We've been in a Cold War for some time. I agree with Ray that Putin is trying not to respond to provocation, not to get drawn in. You read nationalist voices in Russia. Putin is actually a very moderate personality in a Russian context. There's some people saying he should have sent the tanks into Ukraine. He should have taken them all the way to Kiev, all the way to Lvov. Obviously, he did not want to be drawn in. My fear is that remember, Trump is running against not just Hillary Clinton, not just against the American media, but an entire corrupt oligarchic establishment, which is just as much Republican as it is Democrat. Look at those letters that have been signed by dozens and dozens of national security specialists opposing Trump because he's irresponsible. My fear is if Hillary wins and this crowd stays in and the kind of policy we've seen over the last couple of decades continues and intensifies, we're not just looking at a Cold War situation. We're looking at the prospect of a hot war with a nuclear power. With Russia, I wouldn't rule out, by the way, a war-like confrontation with China either in the South China Sea. These people are terribly irresponsible. As Ray says, they haven't met a war they didn't like. Hillary is certainly of that mind. When you hear, again, not to pick on Mr. Morell again, the idea that we should be assassinating Russian personnel in Syria, doing it covertly, but so they'll get the message. Are these people think this is a game? I'm afraid there are a lot of people in Moscow and maybe some people in Beijing who are beginning to get the cold, queasy feeling that the Americans are set on war, or at least risking war, in order to maintain our dominance over them. And I fear some kind of a stupid miscalculation that results in a hot war, not just a Cold War.
But Ray, is there a recognition in the United States that there's a lot of things that they need to cooperate with Russia on? For instance, Syria, what's the situation going on there right now, as well as counterterrorism? Is that happening right now?
The intelligence services are cooperating on counterterrorism. And it's interesting you mentioned Syria in this connection, because Syria is much closer to Russia than to the United States. This is a problem. Putin has skin in this game. He's got about 3,000 Chechens and other people from Central Asia who are being trained, equipped, and becoming really good terrorists in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, okay? What happens when they come back? He's got to deal with that, and he's told Obama that. When they met at the UN in September, and Putin said, now, I just want to let you know that tomorrow, all those planes that we put into Syria, we're going to use them because we're not really satisfied with the progress that you're making. We hope that you'll cooperate with us. To his credit, Obama said, Kerry, meet with Lavrov, work it out, make sure we don't shoot each other down. So you're right, there are areas of cooperation. But when we're talking about Trump, a broken clock is correct, absolutely correct, twice a day, right? And when you look at him react to imagined or real slights, he says, I'm going to punch him in the mouth. Now, is that the kind of person that you want to have with his finger on the nuclear button? I don't think so. And so I think this is something that really needs to be addressed when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says Russia is the existential threat with no proof. What's new? Why do you say Russia? Last time it was terrorism. Last time it was some drug that's going on, or disease. So there are real problems here in terms of our military and the military-industrial complex. And let's face it, war is really good for business. Peace, not so good.
And that is an entirely new and different conversation. We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us.